Corinthians chapter 13. And I want to encourage you, grab your Bible, get ready to get into the Word of God tonight. And we're going to try to be succinct and precise, but I've got a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to jump right in as quickly as we can. We're in 1 Corinthians 13, and so far, everything we've read about charity has been in a positive sense. So tonight, we actually enter into a new category of this definition, and the category of this definition has to do with what love is not. Okay, we've been learning charity suffereth long, charity is kind, and frankly, those were pretty predictable. If I was writing, even without understanding God's love, what love is like, I would probably at some point talk about, suffering long and being kind, but I think tonight might spark some really good conversation because of the nature of this particular subject being a bit more obscure. And I'll tell you, when I entered my study, I thought this might be kind of a simple lesson. It turns out it's a very deep subject, a very promoted subject in the Bible, and it's the subject of envy. And in this case, it is proposed as one of the few things that is the antonym of envy. Remember synonyms and antonyms in English class? A synonym is a word that you could say that would be the same as another word. So like dog and canine, it's same thing. It's a synonym. Dog, cat, antonyms. You could argue that. But the opposite of something. Here is a list of antonyms of love, and it starts with envy. And so let's grab our Bibles, 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4. Really looking forward to our conversation based on this text today. 1 Corinthians 13:4 says, "Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not." I actually think a lot of people's definition, I know that mine, prior to this study, has been maybe not wrong or probably just half-baked, just not quite done yet, not full, not complete. And as I've studied this subject over the last, probably 2 years, I've grown in an understanding of it, and I hope that it can be a benefit to you today. So we have to start with the definition, and frankly, the definition drives the rest of the lesson because envy is so prominent in our world, but it's misunderstood. And when we don't understand the sin, it's kind of like one of those tools that always trips us up as Christians, and we're like, man, how did that happen again? And we need to become wise to this. We need to be wise and, as the Bible says, vigilant in understanding our adversary. And this is one of his greatest tools when it comes to our loving relationships. Not just one of his greatest tools in this world, though it is, sinners to sinners and Christians against sinners and just all the mess of sin that we get ourselves in all the time. But particularly, this is a problem when it comes to our love relationships. This is a thing that trips me up between me and my wife, between me and my kids, between me and my friends, between me and my brother, between me and my church. These are the things, these antonyms of love that tend to creep into loving relationships. I don't think it's an accident then that it's listed in the definition of love. If you're wondering, envy is the opposite of a loving response, though it is a common response among people who love each other but aren't walking in the Spirit. So we learn a lot from these antonym words that talk about the opposite of love. How about a definition? Okay, it's a little dense, it's a little thick, but we're going to unpack it throughout the rest of our lesson. Here it is. Envy is a murderous emotion that looks at the success of another and attempts to destroy the success in them, even if it means destroying the person in the process. Let me reiterate that in a simpler way. Envy sees someone promoted. Envy sees someone get an award. Envy sees somebody feeling great about themselves. Envy sees something positive going on in someone else's life. And it's not the same as covetousness. It's not just seeing that prize and saying, I wish I had it for myself. In fact, many times envy doesn't even want the thing. It just doesn't want the person who has the thing to have the thing. And envy goes further than that. It doesn't just want the person who has the thing to have the thing. It wants the person who has the thing to have equally proportioned failure in that arena of success. So if someone is given an award, they don't want just the reward to be retracted, but they want a demotion. They want that person to be ashamed rather than celebrated. They want that person to be impoverished rather than made more rich. And that is the depth and the horrible nature of envy. And before you start thinking, yeah, that's really bad stuff, put that in the category of murder. Yes, it's in the category of murder, but don't put it so far away in your mindset to think that you're immune from it. Like that's only what really, really bad people do. I think we'll find out from our study tonight that that is a very common tactic that we use against people that we love when we walk in the flesh. Where people are honored, we want to see them pitied. That's what envy is all about. I don't want just somebody to be stripped of their honor. I want them to be so ashamed that the world looks at them with pity. Let me give you some biblical examples. God accepted the sacrifice of Abel, and Cain, intoxicated with envy, sacrificed the life of Abel. Isn't that ironic? It's ironic, but it's not just an accidental irony. The fact that Cain's sacrifice was not accepted, Abel's sacrifice was, so Cain decides to sacrifice Abel to satiate his anger. It's ironic, but it's not accidental. In fact, I believe that that was very much on purpose. And God says that the blood of Abel cries out to my ears. This is all sacrificial language. In other words, it really had nothing to do with Abel. Cain's problem was between he and God, but as he is not accepted and his sacrifice is not acceptable, he looks over at his brother Abel and his was accepted. And he sees this success of his brother in the sacrifice, and he not only doesn't want Abel to be promoted, and he's not only frustrated with the fact that he's not acceptable to God or his sacrifice is not acceptable, he wants Abel to pay for the fact that he has been promoted, and he forces the issue. Another example, Joseph was celebrated. I mean, the prized son, the favorite. He was promoted. He was given special treatment. So how did his brothers respond? Well, they responded with the way envy responds. They attacked him and they threw him into obscurity. Where he was the celebrated son, they wanted him to be the forgotten son, the obscured one. Where he was promoted and celebrated, they wanted him to be ashamed. When he was rich with a new jacket, they wanted him to be impoverished and made into a slave. They converted his story from riches to rags. That is what envy seeks in the life of people to where it is aimed. Acts 7:9 tells us specifically, I'm not just making it up, it tells us specifically the patriarch's motivation was envy. It says, and the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. How about another example of envy in the Bible? David was celebrating the victory that God had won. Remember, they brought back the Ark of the Covenant, and he's throwing a party, and he's giving everybody bread and flesh and wine, and they're dancing, and he's jumping up and down extravagantly, honestly, really out of control. Maybe not out of control, but just exuberant worship and praise of God. And what's going on up in the palace? His wife, Michal, is burning with envy. She can't stand it. In fact, when he comes into the house, what is her tactic? What did she do? She wanted to take his celebration and turn it into a rebuke. She wanted to take his happiness and make him feel bad about it. She said, oh, you look at you dancing in front of all the daughters of Zion. He wanted his celebration to be a shameful experience. She wanted his noise and his shouting and his singing to be turned to silence. That is envy. How about some modern, day-to-day examples? Okay. A son might be praised at dinner for achieving good grades while his brother sits in silence. When the compliment is complete, he blurts out, yeah, but I could trash you on the basketball court. What's that? Well, he takes the praise of achievement and he converts it to his brother's shame. That's envy. How about a husband-wife illustration? Here's one. Maybe the husband's out of shape and his wife eats well and she exercises. He grows distant and cold because of envy. So he purposefully gives her the silent treatment. After all, she thinks she's so successful. He wants her not to feel successful, so he makes tension in the marriage in order to achieve a sense of helplessness and failure in her life. Someone's got to do the work and pay the bills after all, so she can do her little workout. He makes the marriage unhealthy on purpose to break down the wife's perception that she is healthy. I'll teach her to think we're healthy. I won't talk to her tonight. That's envy. And it breaks up loving relationships. The Sanhedrin, elite spiritual leaders, they begin noticing some no-name peasant from Nazareth. Over time, he starts getting a name for himself as some spiritual leader. And over time, Jesus becomes the talk of the world. In an all-out unleashing of envy, they attack. They strip him naked to attack his dignity. They nail him down to remove his liberty. They laugh and mock to negate his validity. They give him a robe and crown of thorns and ascribe the words King of the Jews above him to attack his sovereignty. They crucify him to attack his humanity. They bury him to attack his deity. Envy looks at all the wonderful things of a person and not only wants it removed, but wants retribution in a negative sense to make sure that person knows, oh, that's not the King of the Jews. We will mock him like crazy. Oh, you think you're so stable, Jesus? Let me push you down. What a messy business envy employs us in. But the law of implication teaches us that envy isn't listed here in the love chapter for no reason. In other words, like I said earlier, don't act like this isn't something that we all struggle with. Like this is just something the really, really bad people deal with. I don't think it'd be the third listed item in a definition of love if it wasn't something prominent and important and dangerous that we ought to take notice of. We aren't often envious of those that we care nothing for. Have you ever thought about that? I might have other negative things. I might have other sinful responses to somebody I care nothing for. Have you ever been to an awards ceremony for something you cared nothing about? I have. I was growing up, and there was a time where I did love motocross, and I've told many illustrations from motocross, but there was actually a good portion of my childhood that it scared me to death, and I didn't like it very much. And at the end of every motocross, season, there would be an awards ceremony. And I remember going to the awards ceremony, and it was just, to me, it was ridiculous. It bored me. I didn't like it. It seemed like there was an award for everything. There was an award for the guy who built the track. They'd give an award to the winners of every single racing category that you could dream up. In my mind, I was thinking, big deal. Okay, I was not moved to envy in those situations because I didn't love the thing that I was observing. But the opposite is true when it comes to things that I do love. When I do love some of the things I used to love and still do love, I love academics. I love going to school. Call me a weirdo, call me a nerd, fine. I liked school. And some of the strongest emotions of envy I have experienced, and I don't want to just relegate this to emotions, some of the strongest sin of envy I've ever expressed in my heart that I have had to deal with has been when other people succeed in an academic or philosophical or even vocational success. And that has been some of my struggles in regards to this. 1 Corinthians 13:4 implies something important. It implies that we can tend to envy those we love. We can. That's why it's number 3 in the list. That's why it's the first of the antonyms. Charity is not, whatever's making you envy that person, it's not love. Don't misidentify this. In other words, envy wouldn't be listed here if it wasn't a very common pitfall related to love. It could say charity is not a sandwich. That'd be ridiculous. Charity is not a sandwich. Why is that ridiculous? Because sandwiches have nothing to do with love. That's ridiculous. It has nothing to do. We're not talking about something that has nothing to do with love. In fact, envy is not love, but it does have a lot to do with love because it is one of those opposite things that we tend to throw into the mix of a loving relationship. I think it's one of Satan's number 1 tools to break up marriages. It's envy, and it's awful. Aren't we often the most hostile to the people we love? Cain and Abel were brothers. The patriarchs and Joseph were brothers. So often, the people who express envy, not so often, every single time, it is actually in the context of what should be a loving relationship. So what is envy in the Bible? Well, let's get to the Greek word here. The Greek word might sound something familiar to you. Zealao. Okay? It literally comes from the word zeal that we get. It's that burning, but it's in a negative sense. envy and zeal are related, but they're not the same. They kind of look the same, but they're so different. Okay, zeal is just a plain thing. It can be negative or positive. Zeal is, some people are really zealous for football. Some people are really zealous for food. In the Bible, there's that guy, Jehu, and he was very zealous. Remember, God gave him directives, and that guy was passionate to do God's plan. Okay, so zeal is a good thing or a common thing. It's just that passion, that desire that motivates somebody to be really engaged in whatever it is that they're in. But zealao is envy. And let me read you the Greek definition of this. It means to burn with zeal, to be heated or to boil with envy, hatred, or anger. All right, it definitely has that boiling up sort of thing. When you have envy, and every single one of us have experienced the feeling of envy, it's a sin, but it's also something you feel. And it really is a good word picture to think of a boiling over pot. If you've ever boiled potatoes, maybe to make mashed potatoes, and they're boiling, if you're not watching it, it can boil over, right? That's kind of what envy feels like. It's like something you feel like you've got to let out. You're watching somebody promoted, or there's something that you just think is injustice because they're getting praised, and you know the truth. And so inside it's just like, oh man, it boils up inside. That's the Greek word picture. Mark presents Jesus, to kind of shift focus just a little bit. We're going to come back. Mark presents, the book of Mark, Jesus in terms of really some pivotal cultural values of his day. All right, these are a little foreign to us, except for if you know much about some Asian cultures or Middle Eastern cultures, this might make a little more sense. Not American. Honor and shame is what I'm talking about. And America is not so focused on honor and shame, though those are important to us. It's more like success. It's more like achievement, riches. In fact, in our world, things that ought to be shameful are sometimes even celebrated. Like whatever you got to do to get on top. You know, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. It's like ways that we almost excuse shameful behavior. But that's not quite what it's like in a lot of Asian or Middle Eastern cultures, even today. And definitely in Jesus's day, the top two things everybody was talking about. This is what you lived for. It wasn't about achieving a rich, retirement or building great things. Those were cool, but the top two things were honor and shame. Honor and shame were so important. It was all about honoring the family name, all about bringing honor upon yourself. And the worst thing that could happen to you was shame. That's why if you think about the story of Esther and you've got Mordecai and Haman, and there's a lot of the motivations going on there is really envy. Haman didn't like that there were any Jews who were being promoted, and he wanted to see them put on the gallows. And then, you know the story that it ends up actually flipping over, and he ends up experiencing the very wrath that he wanted to be expressed to the people he had envy for. In Mark chapter 15, like I said, it says in verse 9, "But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews?" Oh, that was, as far as Jesus' case is concerned, that was the wrong thing to say. That was the very essence of their envy. This is not our king. So he says, "Will you that I release unto you the King of the Jews?" Verse 10, he actually knew. He knew what he was doing when he called Jesus, not Jesus. He calls him the King of the Jews. He knew what he was doing, Pilate did. Verse 10 says, "For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy." He's actually prodding them along in their envy. They don't like that this guy is so prominent, and it was really, envy was the essence of the thing that got Jesus onto the cross and died. Now, Jesus died for all sin, but I'm saying that the accusers of Jesus and the people who ended up physically bringing about his crucifixion, it was envy that was at the core of their motivation. They didn't like that he was honored, and they wanted him to be ashamed instead. Some ancient stuff. Aristotle actually talks about envy. He said this in a definition. It's a certain kind of distress at apparent success on the part of one's peers in attaining the good things that have been mentioned. Not that a person may get anything for himself, but because of those who have it. Aristotle's pointing out that nature of, it's not even that they wanted themselves to be considered the King of the Jews. They just really didn't want Jesus to be considered the King of the Jews. One of the commentaries I read said this: "Envy basically consists of pain or distress caused by another's success. Kind of rhymey, helps me think about. So I experience pain and distress because someone else is experiencing success. And really, you think the only way you can be satisfied and feel better about it is if you attack that person. The distress we feel when we are envious of someone compels us then to attack them. Envy is actually, all sin is very dangerous, but envy is particularly dangerous to your loving relationships. It's very dangerous between you and your siblings or your friends or your spouse or your church, because envy doesn't stay internal for long. That's why the word zilao is the word for envy. It boils over. Something has to be done, and fast, when envy begins in your heart. It's not quite like some of those other things, like jealousy or maybe some anger that you can bottle up for a while. Envy doesn't last long. It really doesn't. It starts and it needs to be acted upon, whether it needs to be stamped out or if you think you're going to just act on it so that you can be satisfied and relieved of that inner tension in yourself. Envy has to work quickly. It tries to destroy those who succeed, obtain, or receive honor. Envy is the sinful cousin of the godly trait of emulation. All through the Bible, we see example after example. People we're supposed to emulate, just like we've studied the last 2 Sundays. Timothy and Epaphroditus. Paul is actually lifting them up. He's actually praising them publicly, calling them by name. Timothy's a great guy. Epaphroditus is a wonderful guy. Look at all the great things these guys do. And the idea is not to provoke anyone to envy. It's to provoke them to love and to good works. It's to provoke them to emulate the example that these guys were showing. But it so quickly can convert from a biblical, godly, and healthy picture, a model of that I can emulate. I see someone's success. What happens when I see someone's success? One of two things. I either want to emulate it and grow because of it, or I want to tear it down and I don't want them to experience it ever again. Those are really two responses in the human nature, or in Christian nature, I ought to say, when it comes to someone's success. You either want to emulate it or you want to destroy it. One of the two. By the way, I believe envy is a sinful distortion of something good God installed in us called admiration. In the early stages of a romantic relationship, if one party is unaware, we say they have a secret admirer. This love language, it's, oh, you've got an admirer, a secret admirer. And that's an exciting thing to maybe hear in the dating relationship, or before you even know if they like you at all. They admire you. They aspire to you. What they see in you that's praiseworthy, they want to emulate, and they like what they see. We say that because our love is often aimed at those that we admire. Admiration properly managed leads to emulation and a biblical and good expression of jealousy. Jealousy can be bad, but it's actually something that God expresses, and it's a good thing. So emulation is striving to imitate and model what's honorable about those that we love. Jealousy is emotional distress that strives to protect and retain what's honorable. So God's jealousy for his people is truly based in his love. It really is. When honor is attacked, jealousy retaliates and fights for that which is loved. That's what jealousy is all about. What was honorable about God, his omnipotence, glory, etc., should have inspired admiration and even emulation in Lucifer. But what did it inspire instead? Envy. That's what it inspired. Lucifer didn't look at how great God was and say, man, I want to be more like him every single day. No, what that did for Lucifer was he saw God as a goal to accomplish, as an opponent to defeat, as one that needs to be brought down. Instead of saying, I admire God and I strive to emulate him, he said, I'm going to take him down and I'm going to sit in his chair. That's what envy does. The sinful heart and Satan are crafty, but frankly, they're not often all that creative. Most of Satan's tools, and I believe that's why it fits into a definition of love, most of Satan's tools look very similar to God's thing, the things that God makes, and he just twists it just a little bit. And I think envy is one of those things. When we look at someone's success, or if we even see someone whose honorable traits are being attacked by someone else, that ought to provoke me to jealousy, to defend them, or love, to emulate them. And Satan just twists it just a little bit and makes the person who is achieving the one who you want to take out. Acts 17:5. But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. Do you remember what was happening in Acts 17? That's actually when the church of Thessalonica was born. And the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are written after all of this takes place. But what happens is Paul and his church planting team, all the elders that went there to start the church, they were actually extremely successful. And very quickly, an awakening happens, and people start getting saved left and right. And what happens is they are becoming successful to the detriment of the people, of the economy of Thessalonica, because so much of the economy was built on these idol creators, the artificers and blacksmiths who are making idols for people to purchase and then worship in their tents. It's ridiculous. And now they're losing money because Paul and Jason and all the other guys are preaching against all these other gods, and that there's one God and he's not made with hands. And so envy provokes them to then beat these guys up. I mean, there's literally a riot in the streets of Thessalonica, and Paul and the rest of his crew have to leave. It says they assaulted the house of Jason. This is envy. So envy upon conception immediately begins converting the emotion into action. Like I said, it doesn't last very long. Envy immediately wants to do something about it. The goal of envy, as one commentary said, is to behold the victim of his envy pass from happiness to misery, that he who is admired and emulated might become an object of pity. Another commentary said, honor provokes envy, which issues in conflict and hostility. So as we come to a close, how does this really apply? What do I need to do about it? As a Christian, how do I, protect against envy against God? Because the greatest commandment is to love God, and if this is part of the definition of love, then I need to make sure I don't grow envious of God, which is like the most satanic thought I can think, I guess, because that was what was Satan's original intention, was envy, which meant he wanted to demote God and promote himself. So how do I think about envy in relation to myself and God? Is it possible for Christians to envy God? I think so. Let's talk about that in our fellowship groups. How does it tend to play out in day-to-day relationships? I think this is more common. This is probably going to be a bit more attainable for our fellowship groups in discussion, to think about times where envy actually starts to infiltrate our own hearts and affect our loving relationships with brothers and sisters. Here are a few ways that envy commonly plays out in loving human relationships. Gossip. Man, siblings are really bad about this. A lot of times siblings, they love each other. I mean, they would do anything for their brother. They do anything for their sister. They would defend them. They'd go into a fight for them. I've always thought it funny, the way we're just so broken. I had a brother. My brother's 14 months older than me, so we grew up almost like twins. Me and Kyle, we're still really close, good buddies. We couldn't be any more different. We are so opposite in personality, so opposite in most of our skill sets. We have some commonalities. We both have a similar sense of humor. We both have similar music abilities and tastes, and so that we have similarities, but a lot of opposites, my brother and I. And it was always funny. I mean, we could fight like cats and dogs, moved with envy. Frankly, he and I could envy each other really badly because we both had such different strengths. At one moment, Kyle could be promoted for athletic prowess, and I'm like, well, yeah, but he can't pass his math test, and so always comparing each other. And so where envy is present, and then someone comes and wants to, trash talk my brother, and I'm the first one in. So it's interesting that a lot of times our envy is aimed at the people that we love. One of the ways we do this is gossip. Oh, somebody that you love it may be disproportionately talked about in a positive light, and you want to do what you can to make sure that everybody knows they're not quite that good. Oh, I've got stories about my brother. I could tell you stories about him. He's not quite the hot shot, everybody. Yeah, I could tell. And you kind of take, a lot of times it comes off as humor. But really what you're doing is gossip and slander. And what you're trying to do is break down that person you love in the sight of other people just to make sure they don't get too elevated above you. How about this one? Ostracism. Leaving them out. Isolating them. I love you, honey, but, this is just a guy thing. Or, this is just kind of my thing. And envy plays in a lot of different ways. Arguing is a natural way envy plays out. You see somebody achieve something, have something, be promoted, or just simply have basic happiness. They're having a good day, you're having a bad day, and you want to make sure they don't have a good day anymore. So you're going to enter into an argument with them and spew your filth all over them just to make sure. How about this one? Litigation, making legal charges. That ought not to be so, but it does happen. How many times when there's a death in a family have you heard or seen people who love each other, who would do anything for each other, end up fighting in legal battles over the possessions of the deceased loved one? It's sick, and it's wrong, and it's very common. Happens all the time. And the last one would be murder. Honestly, like some of the most common murder cases. Now, I'm no detective, and I haven't been into law enforcement very much. I've not read a whole lot, but I'm astonished when I learn about crimes committed. They're almost always, not every time, but very frequently, they're committed against people who love each other, or at least at one point did love each other, and it led to murder, just like Cain and Abel, just like the patriarchs and Joseph, who didn't necessarily murder him, but they had murderous intentions and, did everything they could but murder him. And many times, murder is the end result of envy. All right, well, I've said my piece. I've taught the lesson. Now let's break up into our fellowship groups, our Zoom groups, and let's talk about the implications. Let's talk about, okay, so what are some times where you've seen envy at play in your own life or toward you? And let's talk about how we can grow from this lesson into better lovers of God and better lovers of our neighbors. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word. I pray that you'd help us to understand this. Lord, I feel that maybe there's a danger with this subject that we would pass this off, even in our coming discussion in our Zoom fellowship groups, that we would pass this off as that's something other people deal with. There's really not much to say. Oh, there's so much to say, Lord. I pray that you would bring clarity to our minds, that we could teach one another in our fellowship groups tonight, that everybody present would be able to participate verbally in helping each other understand and express their thoughts, Lord, so that we can grow deeper in love with you and deeper in love with our neighbors and with our brothers and our sisters and our families and friends. And Lord, that we would eradicate envy from the relationships of love that we have. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, off to fellowship groups. We'll see you then.